Property. It's as safe as houses, right? A place you can park your money, sit back and enjoy passive returns as you sip pina coladas on the beach whilst flexing on Insta. But what's the reality? In this video, I want to run through what I consider to be the 5 worst property types that you can invest in when you're starting to grow your business. And I'm doing this from a position of experience. Over the last 15 years or so, I've bought and sold over £10 million worth of property and used pretty much every strategy that's taught out there, from rent to rent to new build developments. Over that time, as well as having lots of big wins, I've also made plenty of mistakes. And I want to wrap those lessons up in this video to help you mitigate the risk in your own property business. Over that time, as well as having plenty of big wins, I've also made lots of mistakes. And in this video, I want to wrap those lessons up for you to help mitigate your own risk if you're just getting started in property. Remember Uncle Warren's famous quote about investing. Rule 1 is never to lose money. Rule 2 is never forget Rule 1. Now, one of the issues I have in the property social media space is people posting glossy images of their new deals with a load of hypothetical numbers attached. Whilst the reality is it's actually difficult to assess the success of a deal until it's been up and running for some time. Rather than rely on social media posts, I feel it's important to learn the lessons of those who have walked the route before us to make sure we future-proof our investments. So let's dive into the first property type that I would advise you avoid like the plague, which is buying properties in areas affectionately known as the Bronx. Now, it goes without saying that the majority of property investors are looking to create the highest return on their cash as possible. And so on paper, it makes sense to buy the cheapest properties with the highest rents. Now, in a lot of areas, the baseline rent is always going to be set by the housing benefit rate. And so therefore, buying those cheapest properties on paper is going to give you the highest yields. But here's the issue with super high yielding areas. That hypothetical paper return very rarely manifests into reality because you're going to be dealing with the most challenging tenant demographics. You can expect to have a higher rate of tenant turnover, higher rate of damages, and most importantly, a higher rate of rental arrears. Look, right now we're seeing more and more regulation in the private rental sector, and therefore it's getting much more difficult and expensive to remove problematic tenants. And yes, you might have a month's worth of deposit to play with, but that barely even costs starting the eviction process now. And in reality, it's going to take 6 to 9 months to remove that tenant. And from my experience with tenants like this, not only are you going to have thousands of pounds worth of arrears, you'll also likely have thousands of pounds worth of damages to deal with when you get your property back. So all of a sudden, those high paper returns are dropping significantly at best, and at worst, it's actually going to end up costing us money. So we clearly need to avoid the Bronx. And if that's the case, where should we be buying? Manhattan? It would follow that the better the area, the less risky the tenant type. And in a perfect world, our ideal tenant is going to be highly paid with a secure income and is going to treat your rental like their own home. But if we go too far in the other direction, it brings me to the second type of property that we need to avoid: low yielding property. Now, I want to make it clear that all of these properties that we're talking about today could be made to work by the right person in the right circumstances with the right resources. So look, if you've got a huge pile, and I mean millions, sitting around in a bank account and are looking to park it somewhere, then firstly, lucky you, you've done well in life somewhere. But secondly, you might be happy just to stick it into low yielding prime real estate. For example, in major cities like London, you'll see a lot of foreign investment flow in, where they park huge amounts of money in prime areas, and very often these properties just sit there empty for most of the year. But if you're looking to generate an income from property, you need to understand the different types of yield, but also what return you need to get on your capital to create your target income streams. Now, you probably hear many people talk about the gross yield on property, which in simple terms is the return you're getting on the value of the property itself. So if we go and buy a 50 grand property in the Bronx and it rents out for £5,000 a year, we're making a 10% gross yield. If we're buying a £1 million apartment in Manhattan and it rents for £50,000 a year, we're making a 5% gross yield. So you can see here that our Bronx property on paper is giving us twice the yield as our Manhattan property. Of course, assuming that we can find a tenant who's going to pay the rent. But gross yield is actually a really bad way of assessing the returns we can get on property if we're using leverage. And by that, I mean getting a mortgage. Now, this concept is especially important now we've left that era of cheap debt and with interest rates set to stay high and persistent for quite a long time to come. So let's look at both our examples again, but this time we're going to buy them with a 25% deposit and get a 75% mortgage at a 5% interest rate. We'll need to calculate the yields again, but this time it's going to be a percentage return on the deposit we put in, and the rent roll is going to have to be adjusted by the interest we're paying on the mortgage. This is called net yield. With our Bronx property, we're going to need a 12.5 grand deposit, a 37.5 grand mortgage, and we're going to be paying £1,875 a year in interest. This means we're now making £3,125 a year on a 12.5 grand investment, and that's a 25% net yield. Now, a Manhattan property is going to need a £250,000 deposit, a 750 grand mortgage, and it's going to end up costing us 37.5 grand a year in interest. Now, this interest element is going to eat significantly into our 50 grand a year rent roll, and actually leaves us just 12.5 grand a year return on our £250,000 deposit. By a funny quirk of mathematics, using these arbitrary figures, the net yield actually works out as 5% as well, exactly the same as the gross yield did on this property. So you can see this Manhattan property is actually very low yielding. And the problem with low yielding properties, all you need is one unexpected expense, a roof to go or a boiler to go, and it's going to wipe out all of your cash flow. So what's the answer here? Well, actually, I don't particularly care about gross or net yield. As a momentum and a cash flow investor, the only thing I care about is the return on the capital I leave in a deal. It's called the ROCE, return on capital employed. So in really simplistic terms, what we're looking to do is to add value to any property and then recycle our funds out. This means we're going to be leaving less cash in a property. And by default, our return is going to be much higher, making our cash work better for us. So let's revisit this Manhattan property. Let's say we actually bought it for 600 grand and we spent 200 grand renovating it. So we're now all in for 800,000 pounds. The flat is still worth $1 million. So we can now get a 75% mortgage and pull 750 grand out again. This means we've only got 50 grand of our own money left in it. After the interest costs, we're still only going to be netting 12.5 grand a year on this property. But we've only got 50 grand left in it. So we're actually getting a 25% return on our capital now. What we've actually done is we've increased the yield on our capital by 5 times on the same property just by having the ability to add the value and recycle our funds out. So when I say we need to avoid low yielding properties, what I mean is we need to avoid properties we can't generate a huge return on capital employed. And when I work with my clients, I advise that we need to target a minimum of 30% ROCE. And this takes me to the third type of property that I would personally avoid, which is leasehold flats. And to be specific, I'm talking about single flats here that sit in a block of other flats and you don't own the freehold. Actually, blocks of high density flats where you own them all under one freehold is probably my favorite strategy because in reality, it gives you high yields like HMOs, but with a fraction of the management burden. And it also gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to split them off, refinance, and do various other strategies with. But as an investor, owning a leasehold flat goes against all of the principles we talked about in the last point about achieving a high return on capital employed. Because with these sorts of flats, you're likely to have both the ground rent you have to pay and an annual service fee, as well as the fact that the leasehold itself is actually a ticking time bomb. Now, for the more experienced, lease extensions is actually a fantastic value-add strategy in itself. But for most, this is a countdown against your legacy wealth, which is going to be borne by future generations. But for now, let's just focus on the annual service charges, which are there to cover things like buildings insurance, communal area cleaning, window cleaning, and even gardening. Now, the issue of this for me is that a lot of these costs are out of your control, and you'll generally find that management companies have a habit of hiking up rates and making money for themselves. As an example, look at this flat in the middle of Chester, which has an annual service charge of just under 3.5 grand a year. That's almost £300 a month, which you're going to have to pay as the landlord. Now, comparable rental properties in the area show that a 3-bed flat will go out for about £1,200 a month. So if you allow for 10% management fee and 10% voids and maintenance, we're already down at an average of £960 a month. So when we take off this £300, we're actually only going to be getting £660 a month net rent before we even incorporate the finance costs. This is going to destroy your margins, your yield, and leave you with one arm tied behind your back. So if you're into flats, I suggest that you either buy a block of high density flats on one freehold or buy a commercial property and convert them into residential flats. Now, the fourth property type I want to steer you clear of is listed buildings. And again, look, if you're experienced and know exactly what you're doing, there's a lot of opportunity with listed buildings. But if you're just getting started, there's so much uncertainty that comes along with them, it's difficult to get your figures right. Now, actually, the main issue with a listed building is the input that your local listed building control department will have on any works that you do within it. I don't want to go into the intricacies of when you need to get your listed building control department involved, but take it from me, when they do, they have a huge amount of power. Now, this actually makes it very difficult to accurately appraise your deals, and inevitably, your costs can rapidly spiral out of control. I want to give you an example from a development I did in Chester where I took this derelict building that had been used as a hostel and converted it into 2 townhouses. This development had to go through the full planning process, And also at the same time, it has to go through listed building control planning. And at this point, they can place a whole load of conditions on your development. You can see here that when we got the planning approved, one of the conditions was we had to do the conversion in accordance with a heritage method statement. And of course, this placed extreme limitations on what we could and couldn't do. I can tell you right now that the condition to plaster the whole thing with a 3.5 kilonewton hydraulic lime plaster, whatever that is, cost over 70 grand. But more importantly, took about 4 months to do, so pushed the entire development back. Now, as an experienced developer and investor, we bought this property at the right price. And the whole thing only cost us 150 grand, so it gave us a huge amount of margin to play with. But soon our 250 grand budget doubled to over 500 grand. And we even had to do things like employ specialist contractors who had worked on the Windsor Castle fire refurbishment to come and mould areas of the cornicing that had been damaged beyond repair and replace the whole lot. Just that alone was 15 grand. But look, get it right and there is opportunity. We still made 20% return on this development and are now specialised in Grade 2 listed buildings in Chester with all the knowledge that's up here. But if you're just getting started, I wouldn't advise it. Okay, so the final property type I'd avoid is anything that comes with a glossy sales brochure, which is generally off-plan new build or properties that are abroad. Look, if there's a high-end marketing team behind the scenes pumping out the dream, I'd be running a mile. And I get it. Look, in a rapidly rising market, you could get lucky. You could exchange on an off-plan new build with a very small deposit, and by the time it's built and you have to complete, you can flip it on for a very easy profit. But I could also hop on a plane to Vegas, put all that money on black, and there's a 50-50 chance I'm going to double it. Making money using a particular process does not necessarily mean it's a good one, because generally when people are selling off-plan, they're taking your money and using it to finish their development. And I want you to think of this like a big game of musical chairs. And if the music stops at the wrong point and you've exchanged on a development and the market turns, you'll be left without a seat to jump on as the development grinds to a halt at best or collapses at worst. In the financial crash of 2008, so many investors were left holding the bag with unfinished developments in the UK. And around the world, this is happening all the time as investors are flown out on all expenses paid trips, dazzled in tropical locations, parted with their money before the developers do a runner. So if you do want to buy abroad, do it as a holiday home, not an investment. So that's it, team. 5 of the most difficult property types to make work if you're getting started in property. As always, the more experienced you are, the more likely you'll be to make them work. But I always come back to those rules of investing. Don't lose money. As a starting point, make sure your investments are as risk mitigated as they can be. Because by default, if you're not losing money, you're making money. And if you're struggling to get started or grow your own property business in a risk mitigated way, I put a link in the description to this video where you can jump on a strategy call and we'll map it out together.